From a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux. When is a tank not a tank? There were some technical difficulties with this post when it first went live. They should be resolved now. My apologies for anyone who got multiple email updates as a result of efforts to get the post working. This week, we're going to look at everyone's favorite kind of armored fighting vehicle, the tank. In part, this is a response to my frustration, one shared by, it seems, quite a few people, at the continued inability for journalists in particular to correctly identify what is and is not a tank. But more importantly, it provides an opportunity to discuss what tanks are and what they are for. This isn't going to be a real deep dive into the development and design of armored fighting vehicles, as that is a huge topic. Rather, this is going to be a brief overview of how we got both tanks, but also other tank-like objects, which often get mistaken for tanks, with some particular attention to what these various vehicles are for, what their role is, and how that dictates elements of their design. As always, if you like what you are reading here, please share it. If you really like it, you can support me on Patreon. And if you want updates whenever a new post appears, you can click below for email updates, or follow me on Twitter at Bret Devereaux for updates as to new posts, as well as my occasional ancient history, foreign policy, or military history musings. Defining a tank. Whenever this topic comes up, someone swiftly produces some version of this chart. Image, doctrine, structure, tank alignment chart. Or this somewhat more fanciful version. Image, doctrine, design, tank definition alignment chart. So what defines a tank? If I was pressed for a hard definition, I'd say that a tank is a heavily armored and tracked combat vehicle whose purpose is to offer powerful, direct fire capabilities against a range of enemy targets. This isn't quite a doctrine-only definition, but it is certainly a doctrine-first definition. The technical details, heavy armor, tracks, actually both relate to the specific capabilities they provide, which we'll get to in a moment. But in practice, like many weapons and weapon systems, the tank and its definition is rooted in its developmental history and the problems that tanks were created to resolve. So, where did the tank come from and why? We've actually already discussed this to a degree. The tank was a direct response to the battlefield conditions of World War I, in particular, the trench stalemate on the Western Front. The idea of some kind of armored land cruiser, potentially armed with machine guns, had been floated before World War I, but never seriously considered and developed on. But serious development only began in 1915, with the formation of the Landship Committee early that year. Famously, they needed a code name for their planned vehicle and opted first for water carrier and then for tank, thus giving the tank its peculiar English name. And we should stop to note that, as with any question of definition, this one, too, is language sensitive. The exact confines of a term vary from one language to another. Kampfpanzer, for instance, is not necessarily an exact synonym for tank. In any event, the basic demands of early tanks were dictated by the realities of the Western Front. A tank needed to be able to resist small arms fire, particularly machine guns, deliver direct supporting fire itself, it needed to be able to move on the muddy, artillery-flattened ground, and it needed to be able to cross a trench. This last requirement, the need to be able to climb a parapet, usually roughly 4 feet, and then cross over an 8-foot wide trench, was significant in the design of early tanks. Image, British Mark I tank. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a British Mark I tank, male, meaning it has two quick-firing 6-pounder in the sponsons. You can see just one of them here, angled up. There is one tank in this picture. End of image description. Those factors in turn dictated a lot of the design of early tanks. The armor demands of resisting small arms fire meant that the tank would be heavy, and indeed, as soon as tanks appeared amongst Allied troops, their German opponents began introducing more powerful bullets, like the K bullet, and later the 13.2mm anti-tank round fired from the Mauser 1918 T Gewehr. And here is the first advantage of tracks. The weight of a vehicle is distributed along all of the area of contact it has with the ground. With tires, that area is limited to the bottom of the tire, so the total area of ground contact is fairly low, which is fine for most vehicles. Image: 2 French Renault FT-17 tanks. Image description: via Wikipedia, the French Renault FT-17, in this case in use by the United States Army. Smaller, lighter, and relatively more reliable, the Renault FT was one of the more successful tanks of World War I, but the move towards larger and heavier tanks in the interwar period rapidly left it obsolete. These are tanks. End of image description. But tanks are heavy, really heavy. Even something like the Renault FT could mass around 7 tons, and by later standards, that would be classified as a tankette, a mini-tank, as it were. By World War II, medium tanks often clocked in around 30 tons. If you put a vehicle like that on tires, you are going to create a lot of pressure on those small points of contact. That might still be okay if you were just going to drive on roads and other firm surfaces, which can take the pressure. But remember, tanks were designed for the Western Front, which looks like this. Image: panorama of no man's land in Belgium. Image description: via Wikipedia, no man's land in Belgium, 1919. This is not a tank. End of image description. Fortunately for the Landship Committee, this wasn't a new problem. Farming tractors were also heavy and also had to operate in churned up, in this case, plowed, soft soil. The heaviest of these vehicles had much the same problem, and the solution was continuous tracks or treads. When kept properly tensioned, tune in, by the by, to Nicholson the Chieftain Moran's YouTube for more than you ever want to know about track tension. The track distributes the weight of the tank across the entire section of the track touching the ground, which reduces the ground pressure at any given point, allowing a big, heavy tank to roll over terrain where even a much lighter wheeled vehicle would get stuck. This is one of those points where the functionality of a tank, what a tank does, has such a strong influence on design that the design implications of the functionality become part of the definition. A tank has to be heavily armored and has to be able to move off-road, and as a result, has to be tracked, not wheeled. One might be able to imagine some sort of exotic technology that might make it possible to do all of the things a tank does without tracks, but we don't have that yet. The other factor was fire. I've mentioned this before, but one of these significant background factors of World War I is that lots of the belligerents misjudged the kind of artillery they'd need for a general European war. Not to get too deep into the weeds here, but most of the belligerents expected a relatively rapid war of maneuver and so thought that light, direct fire, note 1, that is, guns that fire in low arcs towards their targets. The opposite is indirect fire, where the projectile is shot mostly up to fall on the target. End of note 1. Artillery, like the famed French 75, the Materiel de 75mm MLE 1897 would be the most useful. Those guns could be moved quickly and could deliver a lot of quick firepower on static or moving formations of enemy infantry in support of friendly infantry. The problem is that in the condition of trench warfare, those guns, as they were configured at least, were far less useful. They were, first off, much shorter in range, which meant they had to be brought dangerously far forward to do their direct fire role, often so far forward they could be engaged by enemy rifles and machine guns. This was compounded by the fact that direct fire at range was ineffective against trench works, which are dug down into the earth. But at the same time, the value of rapid firing, because these lighter guns could fire a lot faster than the heavy, indirect fire artillery, direct fire artillery remained high if only you could get it to the fight. Image: French 75 light field gun. Image description: via Wikimedia, a French 75 light field gun. The formal name for this fast-firing and deadly light artillery piece was the Materiel de 75mm MLE 1897. Brutally effective in its role, the gun suffered from the fact that trench warfare increasingly prioritized heavy artillery over light, fast-moving field guns like this one. This is not a tank. End of image description. This was also a problem a tank could solve. As a mobile armored platform, it could move a rapid-firing direct-fire gun forward without immediately being knocked out by enemy small arms to support the infantry. There is, I should note, early complexity on this point, with both male, heavy direct-fire cannon-focused, and female, machine gun-focused, tanks in World War I, though, in the end, hermaphrodite designs with both capabilities, but much more focus on the main cannon, triumph. So that's what we'll focus on. And that gets us the fundamental role structure for tanks. Enough armor to resist enemy small arms, but with the understanding that some weapons will always be effective against the tank. Enough mobility to cross the churned up battlefield, and some direct fire capability to support the infantry crossing it at the same time. Comes the half-track. The period between World War I and World War II, the interwar period, was a period of broad experimentation with tank design. And so by the time we get to World War II, there are a number of subgroupings of tanks. Tanks could be defined by weight or by function. The main issue in both cases was the essential trade-off between speed, firepower, and armor. The heavier you made the armor and the gun, note 2. Technically here, a major issue is also the size of the gun, since a larger gun means a bigger turret, which means a heavier tank. End of note 2. The heavier and thus slower the tank was. The British thus divided their tank designs between cruiser tanks, which were faster but lighter and intended to replace cavalry, while the infantry tanks were intended to do the role that World War I tanks largely had in supporting infantry advances. Other armies divided their tanks between light, medium, and heavy tanks, along with the often designed but rarely deployed super heavy tanks. What drove the differences in tank development between countries were differences between how each of those countries imagined using their tanks. That is, differences in tank doctrine. Now, we should be clear here that there were some fundamental commonalities between the major schools of tank thinking. In just about all cases, tanks were supposed to support infantry in the offensive by providing armor and direct fire support, including knocking out enemy tanks. Where doctrine differed is exactly how that would be accomplished. France's doctrine of methodical battle generally envisaged tanks moving at the speed of mostly foot infantry and being distributed fairly evenly throughout primarily infantry formations. That led to tanks that were fairly slow, with limited range but heavily armored, often with just a one-man turret, which was a terrible idea, but the doctrine reasoned you wouldn't need more in a slow-moving combat environment. Of course, this worked poorly in the event. More successful maneuver warfare doctrines recognize that the tank needed infantry to perform its intended function. It has to have infantry to support. But that tanks could now move fast enough and coordinate well enough with radios that any supporting arms, like infantry or artillery, needed to be a lot faster than walking speed to keep up. Both German maneuver warfare, Bewegungskrieg, and Soviet deep operations, or deep battle, doctrine saw the value in concentrating their tanks into powerful, striking formations that could punch hard and move fast. But tanks alone are very vulnerable, and in any event, to attack effectively, they need things like artillery support or anti-air protection. So it was necessary to find ways to allow those arms to keep up with the tanks. And indeed, a panzer division is not only or even mostly made up of tanks. At the most basic level, one could simply put the infantry on trucks or other converted unarmored civilian vehicles, making motorized infantry. But as discussed, a whole part of the design of tanks is to allow them to go places that conventional civilian vehicles designed for roads cannot. And in any event, an unarmored truck is a large, vulnerable, tempting target on the battlefield. The result is the steady emergence of what are sometimes jokingly called battle taxis, specialized armored vehicles designed to allow the infantry to keep up with the tanks so that they can continue to be mutually supporting, while being more off-road capable and less vulnerable than a truck. In World War II, these sorts of vehicles were called half-tracks, semi-armored, open-topped vehicles with tires on the front wheels and tracks for the back wheels, though the British Universal Carrier was fully tracked. Crucially, while these half-tracks might mount a heavy machine gun for defense, providing fire support was not their job. Being open-topped made them particularly vulnerable to air-bursting shells, and while they were less vulnerable to fire than a truck, they weren't invulnerable by any means. The intended use was to deposit infantry at the edge of the combat area, which they'd then move through on foot, not to drive straight through the fight. Image: U.S. Army M3 half-tracks. Image description: via Wikipedia, the U.S. Army's M3 half-track deployed in 1940. You can see how the protection it offers the crew and the passengers is not zero, but still relatively minimal. You want to get out of these and move on foot once you are at the fight, since infantry can at least take cover as they move, whereas a half-track is a tempting target for enemy fire. These aren't tanks. End of image description. The particular vulnerability of the open-top design led to the emergence of fully enclosed armored personnel carriers almost immediately after World War II, in the form of vehicles like the M75 armored infantry vehicle, though the later M113 APC was eventually to be far more common, and the Soviet BTRs, Bronetransporter, or armored transport, beginning with the BTR-40. Soviet BTRs tended to be wheeled, whereas American APCs tend to be tracked, something that also goes for their IFVs, discussed below. These vehicles often look to a journalist or the lay observer like a tank, but they do not function like tanks. Note 3. At least, not against well-armed enemies. It is worth noting that when fighting against enemies who lack access to effective heavy weapons, and also don't have any armored platforms of their own that would require something more powerful than a heavy machine gun, APCs could be used as a sort of poor man's tank. End of note 3. The M113 APC, for instance, has just about 1.7 inches of aluminum alloy armor, compared to the almost 4 inches of much heavier steel armor on the contemporary M60 Patton tank. So, while these vehicles are armored, they are not intended to stick in the fight, and are vulnerable to much lighter munitions than contemporary tank would be. Image: a Soviet BTR-152. Image description: via Wikipedia, a Soviet BTR-152, developed in 1949 and deployed in 1950. Note, while fully enclosed, the purpose of this vehicle is transport, not fighting. This is not a tank. End of image description. At the same time, it wasn't just the infantry that needed to be able to keep up. These powerful striking units, German panzer divisions, Soviet mechanized corps, or US armor divisions, etc., needed to be able to also bring their heavy weaponry with them. At the start of World War II, artillery, anti-tank guns, and anti-air artillery remained almost entirely towed artillery. That is, it was pulled into position by a truck, or frequently in this period, still by horses, and emplaced, unlimbered, to be fired. Such systems couldn't really keep up with the tanks they needed to support, and so we see those weapons also get mechanized into self-propelled artillery and anti-air, and for some armies, tank destroyers, although the tank eventually usurps this role entirely. Self-propelled platforms proved to have another advantage that became a lot more important over time. They could fire and then immediately reposition. Whereas a conventional howitzer has to be towed into position, unlimbered, set up, loaded, fired, then limbered again before it can move. Something like the M7 Priest can drive itself into position, fire almost immediately, and then immediately move. This maneuver, called shoot and scoot, or, more boringly, fire and displace, enables artillery to avoid counter-battery fire when an army tries to shut down enemy artillery by returning fire with its own artillery. As artillery got more accurate, and especially with the advent of anti-artillery radars, being able to shoot and scoot became essential. Image: M7 Priest. Image description: via Wikipedia, an M7 Priest self-propelled gun. Note that whereas a tank essentially took up much of the role of direct fire artillery, self-propelled artillery generally takes up the role of indirect fire artillery. This is not a tank. End of image description. Now, while self-propelled platforms were tracked, indeed, often using the same chassis as the tanks they supported, they're not tanks. They're designed primarily for indirect fire. There is, of course, a sidebar to be written here on German assault guns, Sturmgeschütz, and their awkward place in this typology, but let's keep it simple. That is, firing at a high arc from long range, where the shell practically falls on the target, and thus are expected to be operating well behind the lines. Consequently, their armor is generally much thinner, because they're not designed to be tanks, but to play the same role that towed armor, or anti-air or rocket artillery, etc., would have, only with more mobility. So by the end of World War II, we have both tanks of various weight classes, along with a number of tank-like objects, APCs, self-propelled artillery, and anti-air, which are not tanks, but are instead meant to allow their various arms to keep up with the tanks, as part of a combined arms package. MBTs and IFVs. As we get into the Cold War era, one thing becomes simpler. The distinction between different kinds of tanks, heavy, medium, light, cruiser, infantry, etc., largely, note 4, with some exceptions, end of note 4, drops away. Improved engines, suspension, and lighter but more effective composite armor meant that the slightly different roles of the different weights of tank could increasingly be accomplished by a single platform evolving out of late-war medium tanks. You could now fit a heavy tank's gun and armor on a chassis with a medium tank's speed and maneuverability. The first of these universal tanks was the British Centurion, first deployed in 1946. Note 5. You really feel for the British, whose tank designs during World War II often left a lot to be desired, and it is only as the war is basically over that they stumble on one of the best tank designs ever in Centurion. End of note 5. And other countries followed suit. Image: British Centurion. Image description. Via Wikipedia, Centurion, the world's first main battle tank having a favorable mix of armor, speed, and firepower in a single platform. This is a tank. End of image description. The result is the modern main battle tank, MBT, typically between 45 and 75 tons, with a single powerful direct fire cannon as its primary armament. That's not to say design differences between militaries drop away. There are still decisions to be made, the level of emphasis between speed, armor, and firepower, for instance. Another major decision is whether a tank is designed with a 3-person turret, one of whom is a dedicated loader, or a 2-person turret with an autoloader, that is, a machine that does the loading for you. It used to be that now I'd have to go on about why going autoloaders aren't simply obviously the best, but given the live demonstrations of some of the drawbacks of Soviet-Russian carousel autoloaders going on right now, I'll just say that both options have advantages and drawbacks and move on. So, there is variety within the idea of an MBT, but by and large, most countries field just one type of MBT, or one family of MBTs for countries which can afford to retire older systems. And that covers their tank needs. Image: Destroyed Russian T-72B3. Image description. From Rob Lee's Twitter feed, a destroyed Russian T-72B3, with the turret having been blown off. This happens because the ammunition in the carousel autoloader cooks off when the body of the tank is struck and penetrated by enemy fire. The structure of an autoloader makes keeping ammunition secure and channeling any ammunition explosion to the outside of the tank more difficult. But the carousel autoloader design of the T-72, T-80, and T-90 tanks is particularly poor at this. Crew survivability in these cases is extremely low. This was a tank. End of image description. But, of course, nothing could be easy. So just as tanks were getting easier to keep track of, APCs get much more complicated. Even before they were fully enclosed, APCs had generally carried some kind of defensive weapon, usually a heavy machine gun. But you weren't supposed to fight with it if you could avoid it. Beginning in the 1950s, designers, first in West Germany, began experimenting with the idea that an APC could be armed to not merely deliver the infantry, dismounts, but to actually fight when they got there. The thing is, there are a lot of situations where an infantry formation might want more firepower, but where a tank would be overkill. Armored vehicles lighter than tanks, or enemies with lighter formations, for instance. West Germany pioneered the idea by putting a 20mm autocannon on their APC, the Schützenpanzerlong HS-30, enabling it to put out some meaningful firepower, albeit much less than a tank. Image: a Schützenpanzerlong HS-30. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a Schützenpanzerlong HS-30, currently in the German Tank Museum. As you can see, it is still mostly an APC, with the turret not being the main focus of the design, but nevertheless, offering substantial firepower. Despite its location, this is not a tank. End of image description. The USSR cottoned on to the idea and liked it, resulting in the Soviet BMP-1 and the subsequent BMP family of what we call infantry fighting vehicles, IFV. Initially resistant to the idea, American doctrine was that APCs move troops and should not fight if they could help it. The United States, noticing the effectiveness of these sorts of platforms, got into the act with the Bradley fighting vehicle, these days the M2 Bradley. And IFVs, especially the Bradley, look like tanks. And indeed, they are sometimes called on to do the kind of armored reconnaissance and infantry support jobs that in a previous era would have gone to a light tank. Image: a BMP-3. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a BMP-3, prominently displaying both its main armament and the all-purpose Soviet log attachment. The USSR may be gone, but the all-purpose Soviet log survives. You can see the evolution in design, greater emphasis on the weapon, but this is still primarily a troop transporter, with a lot of internal space for the purpose. This is not a tank. End of image description. But they are also notably not tanks, in several key ways. The primary job of an IFV is to move infantry and support them against lighter targets. Some IFVs do maintain some kind of anti-tank capability, but it tends to be more limited. For example, the Bradley's pair of TOW-AT missiles. The requirement that an IFV needs to be fairly fast, but also needs to fit a bunch of dismounts, means they can't carry the firepower or the armor of a tank, often using lighter aluminum armor rather than steel or heavy composites. Finally, the tendency is for IFVs to mount lighter primary armaments, again, space and weight concerns, like the Bradley's 25mm M242 Bushmaster chain gun. The BMP-3 is probably the most heavily armed IFV out there, with a low-velocity 100mm rifled gun and a 30mm autocannon, which is still a far cry from the firepower of the high-velocity 125mm main gun of a contemporary T-80 or the 120mm high-velocity gun of a M1A1 Abrams. Instead, most IFVs would rely on anti-tank missile systems to engage tanks. Although, IFV autocannons can cause a tank serious problems if they engage the rear or side armor, which is thinner. Image: a Bradley M3. Image description. Via Wikipedia, the Bradley, in this case M3, probably the single worst not a tank offender for its appearance. One thing that confuses people in this is scale. The Bradley is taller than the Abrams, just about 10 feet to 8 feet. So it is easy to mistake the proportions. Moreover, that height also goes towards the design consideration. Tanks, because of their offensive role, need to have lower profiles so they can fire and then hide behind things, turret down or hull down position. The Bradley's role is different. It has to fit a bunch of dismounts and or scouting gear, and so it ended up a lot taller. This is not a tank. End of image description. Note that the IFV did not mean the end of the APC, just as the APC didn't bring the end of soft-skinned troop transports. In the US military, the Bradley serves alongside lighter, but still IFV, Strykers, the venerable M113 APC, along with soft-skin HMMWV, Humvees, to be, in theory, replaced with the Oshkosh, note 6, Bagosh, end of note 6, LATV, and trucks of various kinds and uses. Likewise, the Russian Army has its MBPs, which are IFVs, and BTRs, which are APCs, as well as soft-skin vehicles. Or, at least it did, until I am now being told They were all towed away by Ukrainian farmers. The real iron harvest. The final category worth noting here are variations on the concept of the MRAP, mine-resistant, ambush-protected. Infantry transport vehicles designed to resist the sort of dangers one encounters in counterinsurgency operations, mostly mines, IEDs, and small arms ambushes. In essence, these vehicles are a purpose-built version of the up-armored Humvees, designed to operate in a very particular combat environment, insurgencies, and particularly urban insurgencies. These sorts of vehicles have gotten more visibility in the United States because many of them have been shifted into the hands of law enforcement, where their utility is questionable, to say the least. Image. A set of Cayman MRAPs. Image description. Via Wikipedia, a set of Cayman MRAPs deployed in Iraq. I actually use this vehicle when talking to my students to talk about trade-offs in the kind of conflicts a force prepares to fight, because the improvements that make an MRAP safer in an urban insurgency would render it much less viable in a large-scale conventional conflict than thinner-skinned, less well-armored, but lower-profile and faster vehicles. These are not tanks. End of image description. So, what is a tank? In many ways, the role a tank fills hasn't changed much since World War II, when engage other tanks was added to its list of jobs. Tanks provide offensive punch and firepower to allow infantry to advance, seize ground, and maneuver in an environment where, thanks to machine guns, even small enemy forces can put out a lot of bullets to otherwise prevent infantry from doing those things. Tanks also need to engage other armored vehicles and potentially fortified positions. Doing those two jobs require that tanks heave the heaviest armor and the heaviest main gun possible, which both precludes them doing other things, like moving infantry, while at the same time demanding that they be tracked in order to manage the weight of that stuff. I don't think a tank needs to have a turret, by this definition, to be a tank, but most tanks have turrets. But many non-tanks also have turrets. The key here is role and function, not any particular design element. Image. A Swedish Stridsvagn 103. Image description. Via Wikipedia, the Swedish Stridsvagn 103 or S-tank, in service from 1967 to 1997, is a rare example of a turretless tank, though it is worth noting that Sweden's later tanks are turreted. This is a tank. End of image description. What has changed is that tanks have gone from being effectively the only armored vehicle on the battlefield to working in concert with many other armored fighting vehicles, which have different roles. IFVs in particular can blur the line a bit between a tank and an APC, but in most cases, the differences in design, firepower, and thus capabilities between a tank and an IFV is massive. Attempting to use IFVs like tanks is a good way to lose a lot of IFVs. Is the tank on the way out? I don't think so. Nicholas, the chieftain, Morin, did a fairly good overview of that question, but the key point here is that the design of the tank is dictated by its battlefield function, and there still isn't anything out there that does a tank's job better than a tank does. IFVs and other AFVs have to make pretty clear compromises in armor protection and firepower to accomplish their main roles. And while the public may be discovering the vulnerability of the tank for the first time, tanks have always been vulnerable to a wide variety of threats, and have always required supporting arms to mitigate, but not remove, that vulnerability. Now, does it matter that the general public cannot tell the difference between a tank and an IFV? No, it probably doesn't, to be honest. But it does matter that journalists covering wars and politicians making decisions about them also don't seem to be able to, because it hints at a broader gap in the base of knowledge they are working with. Bradley BMP3 isn't a tank, but something else, an IFV, with a different function and purpose, is a fairly entry-level piece of information about modern warfare. And, at some points, that information gap can be abused, as when the German ambassador to the United States described Germany sending Gepard tanks to Ukraine. Tweet from Emily Haber, German ambassador to the United States. Quote, "Two big announcements at the #Rammstein meeting. First, we're sending Gepard tanks to #Ukraine. Second, we'll be training Ukrainian soldiers on German soil. Thank you to the US and @SecDef for hosting, and for fostering further solidarity among allies. #Stand with Ukraine." End quote. Presumably, Emily Haber was attempting to avoid a truer description of the event, which would have been, quote, "Germany is sending largely obsolete self-propelled anti-air platforms, the Flakpanzer Gepard, to Ukraine." End quote. A journalist who is actually qualified to be covering a modern conflict ought to immediately be able to call this out as, at best, an unfortunate mistake, if not an intentional error. But journalists often sadly lack that kind of domain-specific knowledge, which really hurts their ability to inform the public. Edit. It seems worth clearing up confusion here about the German word Panzer. While it is often translated as tank, and so Flakpanzer gets translated as flak tank or AA tank, that's not really right. Panzer means armor. Thus, Kettenpanzer is the German word for mail armor. One of them, anyway. Chain armor, actually. The direct German equivalents for tank are the older Panzerkampfwagen, armored fighting vehicle, but in use clearly means tank, or the more modern Kampfpanzer. Of course, you can just use Panzer in German to mean tank, just as in some cases you can use armor in English to mean tank. Enemy armor coming down the road means tanks, not a procession of breastplates. That said, this article was fundamentally about the usage in English, where tank is more narrowly defined than Panzer is in German. Equipment terminology actually tends to be very language-specific in terms of what it includes and excludes. In any case, here is the terminology shorthand. Any armored fighting vehicle is an armored fighting vehicle, AFV. Convenient, huh? That includes tanks, but also self-propelled artillery and self-propelled anti-air, IFVs, MRAPs, and APCs. A tank is an AFV whose purpose is to offer powerful, direct fire capabilities against a range of enemy targets, infantry, buildings, other tanks, and other AFVs. Tracks, while not a dead giveaway, are good to look for. Not all tracked AFVs are tanks, but all tanks are tracked AFVs because of the demands that the weighted armor and firepower place on them. If you take an APC and put a big gun on it, it becomes an IFV, not a tank. If you take a truck and put a big gun on it, it becomes a technical, not a tank. But that's a story for another post. This post is not a tank. Image: M1 Abrams tank. Image description: this, however, is a tank. End of image description. Edit, turning the post on and off again. Edit 2. For some further viewing, if you want to know more about the development of armored fighting vehicles of all kinds, may I suggest the videos of Nicholas the Chieftain Morin and Bernard Cast, the latter of whom has a channel, Military History Visualized. Both are great channels that I particularly like because they foreground their sources, be that surviving examples of equipment, academic literature, or doctrine publications. This has been a recording from a collection of Unmitigated Pedantry, the blog of history professor Bret Devereaux, recorded by myself, A Great Divorce, for accessibility and sharing purposes. If you enjoyed this content and wish to engage with it or support Bret, please check the description for links to the original post on his blog, his Twitter, and his Patreon. I highly encourage you to share, support, and engage with his works on any and all platforms if you are so inclined. If you wish to support me, please do remember to like, share, and subscribe to this or any other content here that you enjoy. Thank you so much for listening.